So Ty, you're in front of the camera. Hold pages Just be aware you're in front of the camera banging that means you need to pick up the gentleman on stage.
Carl, thanks for your job.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mark Skorka. I am president of Opera America, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the first installment of a new program we have called Masters at Work. During this series of 5 programs, we are going to examine the creation, rehearsal, production of a brand new opera, thinking about every aspect of its development. We're doing this in partnership with 5 universities, and we're delighted to have them linked to us online. Cincinnati Conservatory of Music, Florida State University, University of Houston, San Francisco Conservatory of Music, and Wichita State University. So they are linked to us online, and they will be able to ask questions and participate in our session today. In addition, we have a live audience here at the National Opera Center. They will be invited to participate as well, asking questions, and when you do so, we ask that you go to the microphone that you see in the center of the room and to ask your question from there so that everybody in cyberspace can hear you. And beyond that, beyond the live audience we have here in the Opera Center and the audiences at the 5 university locations, this entire program is also being live streamed so that people around the globe can watch this and also can ask questions. So if you're watching it on the live stream and you go to the bottom of the screen, you'll see you can click onto a place where you can ask the questions. They'll be submitted in writing right here to Laura Lee Everett, who will feed them to us at appropriate junctures in our session. So we have a live stream audience, a live audience, and audiences at 5 partner universities. We're just delighted to have this program. The program brings together 2 threads of Opera America's core commitment to the field. One is the encouragement and support of the creation and production of new American opera, and the other is our commitment to nurturing and encouraging the next generation of artists. So we bring it all together here in this series that will, as I say, have 5 programs altogether. Today, we're looking at selecting the subject of the opera and creating the libretto. The next one in November, we'll look at the piano vocal score and workshops. Then in January, we'll look at the questions of orchestration. In March, we'll have other members of the creative team here to talk about design and production building. And finally, after the opera has been performed, Carlisle will be back with us to talk about the rehearsal process and the premiere itself. So those are the 5 episodes of our program. It seemed completely appropriate, and it is a great honor that we're able to launch this series with someone who has been called the Dean of American Composers, Carlisle Floyd, whose first opera, Susanna, more than half a century ago, was part of the blossoming of American opera and has become such a part of the American opera canon. And here, just a few years later, he's facing his next world premiere, which we look forward to with great anticipation. Others may call him the Dean of American Composers, but here at Opera America, we think of him as our great friend. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Carlisle Floyd. So I've prepared some questions for Carlisle, but once again, I have punctuated my own questions with questions that were submitted in writing in advance from some of the students at the participating universities. And again, they are able to ask us questions in real time too, as are the people on the live stream. So we're going back and forth across the globe as we proceed through the discussion. But I wanted to start with a question about Carlisle Floyd, the great reader. I know from prior interviews that we've had that you read a great deal out of general interest and also in search for subject matter that would be appropriate for an opera. What kinds of things do you read in order to hunt for suitable opera topics?
Well, I suppose I read the synopsis first, and to see if it sounds promising. And if it does, then I take on the entire book, or play, as it were, whichever one. And then in the process, make my determination as to whether it's material for libretto or not.
What in the synopsis would give you the hint that this is something I want to read in its entirety?
Well, to answer that, I would have to answer what is in a libretto, or what is necessary for a libretto to be successful. And there are two very basic things. Number one is what we might call passion and feeling, and the other is activity or action. If it doesn't suggest those two elements, probably would not be successful on the opera stage, because opera abounds in both of those elements. It's not, it doesn't dwell on what happened on just an ordinary day. For an opera to be successful, and a stage piece for that matter, it's a special day, when something happened that was almost a crisis, or created a crisis. People think of opera as being very high-keyed, and indeed it is. And that's necessary to support the addition of music, because music has its own great powers to increase the emotional climate. And that's what it is used for, obviously, in opera. So you have to have an operatic material that supports the sandwiching it in a way with music. The music exposes of a flat libretto more quickly than anything. If you have a couple of old women, as is the case sometimes in soap operas, sitting across from their table, just comparing gossip, you're probably not going to get very far with that. But it's the same thing that I frequently said in talking about opera around the country. If you use very prosaic material, a dialogue, very bad choice for opera unless it is underscored, and undergirded by tremendous kind of emotional force that comes from climaxes and for crises. That's the language of music, or the language of the theater that opera thrives in. When you simply deal with people trading gossip, or without any kind of emotional undertone, you're already in trouble. But I frequently illustrated by saying that if I say, go to the door, without that much emotional urgency, that's not opera. If I say, go to the door, then I'm into the element of opera. I'm into the feel of opera. Now I'm in a heightened emotional atmosphere, and my immediate, as an audience member, my immediate curiosity is elicited. What is the man angry about? What is that woman having to be dismissed from the room? So we are already into the area of opera. So that I think those two elements are the things we look for, whether I read or whether I go to a film or whatever. It's the language of heightened emotion.
There was a question from CCM about what kinds of stories seem to make the best operas. And as they adjust your microphone, because we are doing live television here, Laurie, do we switch to CCM to hear about that question?
Can we switch to CCM for the question about what makes a good libretto, please?
About what kinds of stories make best operas?
What's your question? Hi. Stand right and say who you are. Hi, my name is Kaylee.
Hang on. We need the speaker live. Thank you for sitting through the initial technical.
CCM, you can go ahead.
Hi, my name is Kaylee Decker, and my question was, I was wondering about what kinds of stories particularly make operatic drama.
Good. So the question that came from CCM, Carlisle, was whether there are certain kinds of stories that make better operas. You talked about some of the individual elements of tension, of heightened action. Do you, for your own work, look for love stories? Do you look for stories of jealousy or betrayal? Is there a kind of story that you look for?
Not really, not for me. I mean, I would say that if I'm gripped by a story, or in the case of the prison opera, I was gripped by watching a film, that tells me what I need to explore further. Does this material really, would it take transformation into opera? And if the answer comes back, yes, I think so, then I pursue it.
Mm-hmm. So the type of story isn't material as opposed to its ability to grip and to engage.
Absolutely.
You mentioned getting inspiration from a movie about this piece. Now, Edward Kinniston is a fascinating character, and there are books about him, and then there is the play that we've come to know, and of course the movie. So the movie was your first encounter with the material?
Yes.
And were you watching the movie for the fun of it, or were you watching the movie because you were hunting for an opera subject?
No, unconsciously I was hunting for an opera subject, but I mean, watching the movie, no, it was just simply a movie that intrigued me from the beginning. And then along about halfway, I thought maybe this has material for an opera because it deals with crisis at a very high level. And that's one of the basic ingredients of opera, is crisis.
You've used the word crisis in prior conversations that I've had. And certainly in this story, there are, in a way, multiple points of crisis, which is nice. What is the key crisis for you in this opera?
Well, the key crisis has to do with this man who is the greatest performer of women's roles in the English Restoration Theater. And he has been that since he was a boy. And suddenly his career is threatened by the inclination of Charles II to ban men from doing women's roles and bring women back to the stage where they had been banned for the last 20 years. And that in itself just intrigued me because that's the making of opera and obviously a great deal of tension.
It is a wonderful play, and we'll get to the libretto for it in a second. In thinking more generally about writing librettos, you write your own libretti. Most composers work with librettists in a partnership. And I've spoken with composers who talk about the differences between composing when a poet has written the libretto, or a playwright has written the libretto, or just someone who is good with language has written the libretto. Do you have an opinion about what the best kind of writer is who writes a libretto?
Well, obviously, I think it's a playwright, because I think there are more similarities between playwriting and libretto writing than any other two.
As opposed to poetry.
Poetry, yeah. I was up at the Canadian Opera Company once as a composer in residence to work with two different kinds of librettists, poets and playwrights. Very interesting in that, because the poets were very responsive. The playwrights not so much, but the poets realized that they were in totally new territory, writing in a field of spoken drama. And they were therefore much more receptive to suggestion and criticism. And the playwrights themselves were not as responsive.
Because they felt they had sort of created a work of their own.
That's right. They felt that they had already shown their ability to do that, whereas it's a very separate undertaking.
For you, if it is a poet writing a libretto, does the structure of the language, does the rhyme get in the way of the music, or does it help if you have rhyme within the libretto?
That's a very tricky question. I don't use any rhyme to speak of. I have. In my opera Susanna, I did two different poems that I set it into music. But I think it's a whole different world. The sentiment that poetry deals with is frequently not strong enough or powerful enough to put onto the opera stage, or can be, certainly. We find that degree of tension and emotional tension more in plays or in, say, a movie script. But as soon as you say plays and movie scripts, you're talking about reducing something from about this size to this size. Because libretto, for those of you, and I doubt if there's anyone here who needs information, but of course libretto means little book. And if you've ever put the libretto of something against its other manifestation, a full-length play, you were absolutely amazed at the difference of size, because the concentration is so great in librettos, and has to be. Why? Because of the greater length of time it takes to sing something than to say it. Something as basic as that.
I was going to show the play and the libretto. Here the libretto is much larger than the play, but I assure you that the type is much, much bigger in the libretto. In our conversation, you've talked about the importance of prosody. And prosody meaning larger language structures, larger units of language beyond just the placement of vowels and consonants. How do you think about prosody in the creation of a libretto?
Well, I think a composer has to be very sensitive to that. I remember a very good friend of mine who did the first role of Olin Blitz for me in Susanna, had just come from doing the Stravinsky opera. And he was complaining about the prosody. Of course, it was simply easy to understand because of Stravinsky, and he was Russian, and he was writing an opera on an English script. And also not only that, but a highly poeticized English script. So his prosody was and is still questionable in many ways. Now, what do we mean by that exactly? Well, it's simply putting the accents where they belong, for one thing. It's not simply that, it's just adhering to that very, very carefully. So that you don't write, I'm going to the store, and I want to get some apples. And this is what you get sometimes in very bad prosody. The composer must be absolutely zealous about matching the prosody of the written word.
Now, do you work to match the prosody of the written word when you're setting it, or will you adjust the words themselves to create an architecture that is more suitable for the music?
That's a good question and a tough one. I think I do the first. I think I make the adjustment as I go along.
Mm-hmm. So you don't put the word "the" on the high note in the phrase.
No,
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's absolutely crucial for good diction to make it so that the prose is absolutely on the mark in terms of the English language, assuming you're writing in English. And yet, young composers who are inexperienced, they will almost twist anything to get it into a music line sometime. So you will get to go to the store, things like that, in which you simply have to admonish them, this is not acceptable for the stage.
Mm-hmm.
And when heard, and God help us, we hope we hear the diction clearly, it sounds idiotic and simply humorous. But I think that I do it as I go along. I frankly, being an old-timer like I am at this point in my career, I've done this so much that it comes almost automatically, the prosody, good prosody.
Mm-hmm. Now, Laura Lee tells me that we have a question from CCM, so we're going to try our remote hookup once again.
We need the sound.
We have a question.
We need the sound. Hang on, wait. Don't let them ask. Don't ask yet. Hold on. Can we get the sound in the room, please? Wait. Now ask your question.
Hi, my name is Talia, and you've sort of been talking about this, but I was wondering about your creative process. Do you write text along with music, or do you write text first, or music first? Or how does that process happen? Thank you.
Carlisle, so do you finish?
I didn't hear this.
You could hear it?
I didn't.
Okay. Do you finish the words? Now we should, if we can cut the monitor into the room. Do you finish writing the words before you start composing? So you complete the libretto first?
That's a separate discipline. And I complete, and yet that's a little bit of an accurate answer, because I've done it enough so I know what I'm going to need when I set it to music. And
you know what you need because you have musical ideas in your mind, or you know what you need in terms of the sense of timing and
all of that
rhythm. So even as you're writing the text, you are beginning to hear some musical
thoughts? If you ask me to scan this, I can do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And I transfer it from that, and that's just stored in my tonal imagination, so that I know that when I get to setting that to actual music, it will have already had its shaped form.
Mm-hmm. Do you ever get to the point where there is a new musical idea you had not anticipated, and you need to go back and rewrite the words to fit this musical idea you've fallen in love with?
Yes, and you hate it.
Well, why do you hate it?
Because your music is done. The music is finished, and yet the new music that's suggested by the language is superior. And so you grunt and you twist, but you ultimately have to give into it. Mm-hmm. What is the better of the two?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, the better of the two between this language that works for you as a finished text and this music, which is the better idea, so you adjust one way or the other.
Yes.
Laura Lee, was there a question that you had?
No, I was just...
Swatting at a fly. Okay, so one thing that we talked about yesterday, there are, I think, in every successful opera, there are moments where the music leaves the words behind, that the music does its job to go beyond the words, to define, to tell us about the emotions, about the character of the person who's experiencing the situation. So when you're creating the libretto, do you have in mind in what spots you will create music that goes beyond the words.
Yes, I think I could identify those, yes. And that you hold in your head all the way through. I mean, so that you know that will be coming up at some point. But that's where the emotional heightening comes. And that's what you have to be prepared for, to come up with music that matches it, that matches the intensity of it, at least.
Are there different words in those places? Are there fewer words in those places, or simpler words in those places where you know the music will take over?
That's hard to answer, because the point is that the words themselves usually are evocative. And the evocation usually takes you into the field of pitch, which is what you're dealing with when you come up with a melodic line that, let's say, underscores what you want to do in an aria, or suggests that. But it's if you take a finished libretto, and I'm speaking of myself now, I could take you through it and show you exactly what will be an aria, if there is an aria, where there would be a very where action music is called for. That's something very basic for composers to learn. The very specific needs of action music, because there's a great deal of physical action in opera. And that's always heightened emotion, and requires a different kind of musical treatment. If you have something in which there's a great deal of activity, or let's say anger expressed on the stage, or the two people are going at it in terms of anger or recrimination, and you set that music to something of a very slow tempo, it will undercut it and very much diffuse that scene. So you have to always be aware of what is required dramatically and what that interprets into in terms of music. Now, I'm not sure that I made that clear, but
I'm going to circle back to it, because I want to talk about some specific choices that you've made in creating this particular libretto, Prince of Players. But first, there is a question from Wichita State. And I summarized the question in my notes here as to whether you've ever found great material that you wound up not being able to make into a libretto. Has there ever been source material that has stumped you?
Yes. And, I did a complete libretto adapting a 1927 very famous silent movie, which of course had no words. You sort of got that, didn't you? But the story outline was so beautiful, and the story itself was so touching, that I was very much seduced into trying to set it to words which would convey what was on the screen. And I did a complete libretto. And then I submitted it to one of my staunchest advisors and fairest advisors, David Gockley, in San Francisco Opera. And we've done 6 operas together, so I trust him. And he says, I don't think it works. He doesn't waste time on words, usually. The same thing happened to me when I did my first version of Mice and Men. I had begun to get very edgy setting the music. I had done a complete libretto and about 2/3 of the music, and it was getting longer than the ring cycle. And the thing of it is that I knew this little novella, that I wanted it to be very compressed and very full attention all the way through, but not long. I wanted it to come out under 2 hours. And here I was way over that already. So I submitted it to friends of mine whose basic response I trusted. And the general edict was that it's dull. Well, that's the impossible thing to have on the stage. I mean, that's absolutely forbidden. And so I, little by little, swallowed that, took it in, and decided that I had to start all over from scratch. That I had taken and been seduced by the idea of a novella, but to translate into a libretto, I still had to make a libretto out of it. So I started all over, and a very good friend of mine in the business said to me, never look at the book again. You know it. Write your own of Mice and Men. Very great advice, which I took, and I never did look. So that an English professor of mine, not of mine, but who was a friend, told me, he said, do you know how much of the language in the Mice and Men is yours and how much is Steinbeck's? I said, I have no idea, but I suspect it's a great deal Steinbeck. He said, not so, 80% yours.
So that leads perfectly into another question from Wichita State.
Would you like to, we have that if you want to.
Fantastic, and it was a question about the obligation to the pre-existing material and how much wiggle room is there, in your view, when you're using pre-existing material. Now that's my summary of the question, and perhaps the person who asked that question is on screen right now. Is the person who asked that question with us? Great.
Yes.
So please restate the question in your words, not mine.
My question, well, first, hi, my name is Georgia Ann Yaling, and my question is, what obligation do you feel to the author or the source when you are setting a text and adaptation? And is there wiggle room, was the word I used, in terms of changing words or even potentially order of events to heighten emotional and dramatic tension?
So here you have permission to base your next opera on an existing play. How much wiggle room do you have?
A fair amount, I think. Certainly, if I went back over it now, I would see that I had exploited wiggle room. I mean, I always do that because, as I've tried to say all along, we're translating it into a different medium when we translate it from a play or from a novel into a libretto. So that if you have the permission to do that from the writer, and writers are generally remarkably generous about doing that, or at least that's been my experience, then I presuppose quite a great deal of wiggle room. I know with, for instance, Robert Penn Warren, whose great novel I turned into an opera called Willie Stark, said to me constantly after he saw the libretto, he says, I know why you did what you did, which meant that he recognized the changes I made and also recognized the reason for them. But he still felt it was our work in our opera.
You made some structural differences between the play and the libretto here. In the play, there are two important female characters. Maria, who is kind of a supporting character, but very much in love with Kynaston. And you have Margaret Hughes, who is the first actress to come back onto the stage after permission has been granted for women to be in plays. And you have combined these two characters into one. What was your thinking about eliminating one of them and combining the plot lines of both of them into one?
I simply felt that it was, that in the play I felt that neither of the women characters were fully developed. There simply wasn't the time to do it. Now, the playwright still insists that there is. And he told me, he said, I still think there are two women characters. Interestingly enough, the screenwriter who did the adaptation for the movie took my side, and he combined the two women into one. And you have a much more fully developed woman character that way, I feel. I feel the other way it splits it, and you keep thinking, now, which woman is it? But I've never been inclined to go back and change that.
Another choice that you've made that I think has an impact on the entire opera is that the play makes Kynaston more tragic than you make him in your opera. Even though he faces this great crisis in his career, in real life, as well as in your opera, he gets through that crisis and finds new legs as an actor.
Yes.
An actor playing male roles, not playing female roles. But in the play, they really play up the tragedy of this loss of work in his life. You chose to make it somewhat less tragic for Kynaston.
Well, I don't think of it as tragic, because basically it's how he responds to the edict. He refuses to play men's roles. So therefore, he rather just makes it impossible then to continue as an actor unless he's willing to change to playing men's roles. And he has an enormous, and I got this out of the play, but he has an enormously high regard for the very highly stylized acting styles of the Restoration period, in which so much was done with gestures, with hands. Especially all the women roles were taken, and they prided themselves on this it's almost like kabuki, or something very, very, very highly stylized. But it took great training and learning to do it, because there were so many different ways of responding to one emotion in terms of the gesture. I was looking just last night at a portrait of Kynaston, the only one that I know that exists. And in the portrait, interesting enough, there are his hands in this portrait. They so prided themselves on the skill of interpreting so much through this and how beautiful it is. And he felt that what it took to do this and to do it successfully was really acting. He says, what would really be acting is a man playing a woman playing a man. That would really test an actor. I don't think he ever tried to do that. But nevertheless, he had this great veneration for the acting style of women, and to some extent of men themselves. Great deal of gesture and this kind of almost artificial, it seemed to us. In the play, there's a wonderful moment in which he dies as Desdemona, and the camera comes in on him, and he has placed his hand just in the proper place that you can see it from the audience, and he bends his fingers ever so carefully so that it makes a beautiful picture, the death. And then in my version, before the play's over and his emancipation is deciding to go into a much more naturalistic style of acting and to basically park this very highly stylized kind of acting that he had made his career on. That's neither the play or the movie, really. The movie is very indefinite at the end. And for that matter, so is the play. And mine is not a great deal more. What
is so interesting is that Kynaston's great role, as described in the libretto and in the play and in the movie is Desdemona.
Yes.
And in reading about his portrayal of Desdemona and how the women then portray Desdemona, it's fun to go to see the Met's Othello, which you might be able to watch on HD transmission in a couple of weeks, because the material provokes your thinking about how to play Desdemona. And of course you'll see how it's portrayed in the opera if you go see it. So it's a fun coincidence of timing. Yeah. Even the title of the opera is different from the title of the play. So you've based the material, you've gotten permission from the author of the play to base it on your opera on his play, but you don't use the title. What's your thinking about the title?
I wasn't allowed to.
Really? That wasn't what I was expecting.
The producer said absolutely not. I wanted to simply make it Kynaston, the name of the hero. And they said, who knows what a Kynaston is, you know, spoken like a true producer. And so very gradually I gave it up. They never suggested an alternate title, but it came to me that I liked the title Prince of Players because I think it suggested something of the period. And also, he was the great performer of his time. And so, Prince of Players, it stands, at least for the opera. If I had my way about it right now, I probably would still call it Kynaston, because operas have so often than not taken the role of the leading character, I mean, as the title. But as I said, rather than to fight the producers, I simply came up with I hope, an attractive title.
You'll choose your battles. Now, I know we have a question from Florida State University, so let's turn to the screen and let's get the sound up in the hall and hear this question from FSU.
My question is, do you ever find that when you're composing, you haven't written enough text to fill out the music? And do you ever find that you need to go back and write more words?
Great question. Have you ever found that in order to complete a musical idea you have, that you haven't written enough words and you have to go back and add words?
Absolutely. Nothing is more vexing than I have to do that.
Now, why is it vexing?
Well, you already have the words to satisfy you. But the musical idea says, we're not through here. You know? And so then you have to stop in the middle of composing and come up with text, which is, I don't know, I don't think it is ever as good as what the original text is, because you're under the pressure constantly. You want to get back to writing the music.
And just putting in the word therefore doesn't help.
No.
So you have to probably go back several lines to just make it all flow in a new way.
Especially lines forward.
Lines forward, interesting.
Yes, because usually if you add, you don't subtract, you add words. That's been my experience, at least.
A question from Wichita.
Hi, my name is Demirius. I had a question. When crafting your works, do you craft your works from your intuition or from logic?
Now, I saw that as a written question that came in earlier, and I'm going to ask you if you can explain what you mean a little bit more about this tension between intuition and logic.
Yes, intuition-based meaning, do you feel how your works are supposed to play out, or do you mentally think of how it's supposed to be?
So, you know, do you really map out an architecture, a plan, a blueprint for the work, or do you progress intuitively from the beginning to the end?
It's all mapped out. Very much, and that's what I really was trying to say at the beginning, and I think I didn't. If you're dealing with different levels of tension, which you are constantly, and especially having to guard your levers, parts of highest tension, then you have to map that out, I think, in advance and know this is what you're driving through. It's, or driving to, I should say. You know, it's said, and it's absolutely true, you have to build to an act ending. You build to climaxes. They just don't happen. And all of a writer's skill is required to make those peaks and valleys seem absolutely natural and also satisfying. They say, or it is said that you have to earn a curtain, and I think you do. You build a curtain from way back out. You see the end coming if you're the writer, and it has to be very carefully sewn until the end of the act is achieved.
Does that answer your question about this intuition versus logic question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Sure thing. Representing San Francisco Conservatory of Music, we have Laura Lee Everett. Laura Lee, what's the question?
The question is, how set is the libretto before any music is written? In what ways can a libretto and other structural aspects of the storytelling change once music is starting to be composed?
So, Carlisle, I've heard you say that you do finish your libretto before you start composing. But I've also heard you say that you may modify that libretto if you run out of words. Do you ever do a larger modification because you find that somehow you haven't earned the curtain?
Oh, sure, yes. Once it's set, doesn't mean it can't be tampered with. If you feel that it can be improved, or that needs improving, or if you feel that you've gotten to a particular high point of tension prematurely, that it's not been built to properly, it should seem absolutely natural. The peaks in your piece.
Do you ever do a libretto reading with other people to hear the libretto as a framework without any music?
I have, yes.
And can you tell from a libretto reading whether you have built appropriately to your peaks of crisis and tension?
Pretty much, yes.
So even without the music from the libretto itself?
Yes.
Okay. We have a question from CCM going to the screen.
Hi, my name is Andrea Wells, and I was wondering, you've told so many great stories over the years. Is there a particular story that you haven't yet had the opportunity to tell that you would like to tackle next?
So this is about your next opera. Any question?
I have to interrupt. She can't see me.
Is there a story that you haven't told yet that you really do want to tell through opera?
Not really. I've flirted with an idea for a long time, but I don't know that it'll ever become an opera. And once I finish the one I'm presently on, which I have finished, but it's never finished until it's had its premiere, right. Until it's finished. I'm certainly not going to be talking about starting a new opera anytime soon. It's a 3-year enterprise, and I'd like a little break from that for a while.
You know, like Puccini, a 3-year enterprise. Puccini always took about 3 years for his operas.
Yeah, well, with good reason, I would say.
And with good outcome.
And with very good outcome. Yeah.
Have you ever worked on 2 simultaneously, where you've had 2 projects going?
No, I haven't.
So serial monogamy is the way you've gone.
I think that's fair. Yeah.
A question from Wichita.
Okay. Okay. My question is, hi, I'm Aaron, by the way.
Tell us who you are.
Is after you've got your story set and you're working on the libretto, and you're introducing characters and you're introducing moments and relationships, how do you go about character development?
question of character development. So you have your architecture, you have your plot outline, but now you need to give depth to the characters. How do you do that?
Well, if you know your characters, you simply find in your imagination how you feel those characters would react to a specific situation, or how they would react to a particular turn of events that is implicit in the material. And I think if you, I never have found it that difficult, not if I knew the material that well.
Does more character development happen through the words or through the music?
That's a mean one. It's really both. I'm tempted to say music.
Mm-hmm.
You certainly keep your audience, if you're an opera composer, very much apprised of what's happening in the characters through the music. And I think a character can certainly be greatly enlarged by the music.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know that answers your question or not.
Well, you know, I think it does. I think it tells us how you approach the character development, because if the character development is more through the words, suddenly you're writing a play, you're listening to a play, you're not listening to an opera.
And I don't think you get that same elevation that you get from the addition of music.
There's a question from FSU, and then we'll have one from the room here. Florida State University, you're on.
Wait, not yet.
You're almost on. Good. Go for it.
Hello, my name is Jose, and my question is, when you're writing a libretto, do you go straight from the source material that you're writing from to write the libretto, or do you ever write a middle ground script in order to better condense the ideas?
The process of going from source material to the libretto, do you actually go from the source material to the libretto? Do you absorb the source material and just write your own words? Do you have stages of libretto development that reduce, and then version 3 reduces further and version 4 reduces further? How do you do that? And I'm not being mean. It's this fellow from Florida State University.
No, I think I do the libretto as a whole, and then I start tinkering with it. But the shape is usually pretty well set if I've thought about it enough before I begin the libretto.
Mm-hmm.
And then I can decide that a certain part of it needs amplification, a certain part needs trimming.
If it needs amplification, do you try to find those words in the source material, or do you just add those words from your own spirit?
You can add your own words from your own experience. Yeah.
Question here in the room.
That actually is a wonderful transition to my question. A lot of composers reach out to librettists for their librettos, but in your case, Mr. Floyd, you choose to write your own librettos. I want to know why, personally, you make that choice as an artist.
The question is why you have made a choice to write your own libretti. And I know from prior conversations that you really, as a young person, enjoyed the theater, that you really, that theater is in your blood in terms of enjoying the written word and the spoken word. But a lot of teens find the creative tension to be beneficial. You've chosen to take it on yourself, both the words and the music. Why?
I simply started out that way because I had studied writing all during college, and it didn't seem that big a stretch to me. And it simply kept the whole thing, for better or worse, in one brain.
Have you ever tried working with a librettist?
No, and I think I would.
But that should not be taken as discouragement to any would-be librettist in the room.
I think I'd be far too cranky now. I mean, it might be fun to try sometime, but I would. The point is that it's a very tough discipline, writing a libretto. And unless a writer realizes the differences in writing and libretto writing, he may find himself being instructed by the composer.
What's wonderful today is the enormous quantity of new work is helping librettists refine that art form. Because when American opera was only producing 1 or 2 new pieces a year, there wasn't much of a opportunity for practice among librettists. You knock on the door of the local English professor and say, hey, would you want to write a libretto for me? Whereas today there are practiced librettists, and it's wonderful to see that skill set developing with today's creativity.
It's developing too.
Yeah.
And as in the case of Jake Hege, he's using a great many established playwrights, not a great many, but and it's worked out to wonderful advantage in his case, and he's just one of many. But I think there's more awareness of what the needs of a libretto are now than there were 30 and 40 years ago. And I think people who go into it with the idea of doing the libretto realize that it's a separate art form, and they make it their business to I think the playwrights who go into it make it their business to learn what the differences are, what they have to provide the composer as in contrast to what he has to provide just for stage work.
Have you ever had to throw out beautiful words you've written because they weren't useful?
Oh, yes. Yeah, and it's what is even more difficult is having to delete whole scenes. And that's happened to me a number of times, in addition to the Mice and Men example that I was telling you about. But sometimes it will be the scene that just plays beautifully by itself, but it's not necessary to tell the story. Then very, very painfully you excise it from the material. But I have quite a collection of those scenes.
I wonder if you put them all together, whether they'd make an opera.
I think we'd have a cross, what is it called? Crosswords puzzle if we got that.
That's funny. But by being your own librettist, we won't have published volumes of the correspondence of Carlisle Floyd arguing with his librettists about what he needs. There's a question from CCM.
You ready? Yep. Hi, my name is Frances Rabelais. Mr. Floyd, you told us that when you're looking at a source material, you look for the availability of heightened emotion, and that seems to be more about the plot. Was there ever a source material that you adapted successfully or maybe less successfully that was attractive to you because of the characters?
Interesting. So you talk about the importance of heightened emotion in selecting a subject for treating an opera. Have you ever approached an opera from the point of view of interesting characters, where it was the characters who caught your attention, but not necessarily the intense action?
Yeah, I think I could say I had, yes. But usually, if it's an intense character, they create an interesting life. It's very difficult to have one without the other. I mean, if it's an intense and really dramatic character, you're going to deal with a character who is multifaceted and who experiences life in a very intense and personal way. So it's really hard to imagine one without the other.
Another question from CCM?
Different question.
Whoops. Okay, now can we have the sound?
Ready?
Great.
Hi, I'm Talia Lieberman. I was wondering what Fach means to you, or how you decide what voice type you want for a particular character.
It's interesting that you asked that, and we are doing 5 sessions, and I haven't wanted to get really into the music in this session, how you begin to think about whether a character, at what point you think that a character is a soprano or a mezzo-soprano, and what it is you're looking for from singers. So I note the question, but I'm wondering if it isn't part of our next session where we're talking about the piano vocal score.
Yes.
That said, is it, well, just as a hint, is it early on or later on where you start thinking about voice type when you're writing? Do you think about voice type when you're writing the libretto itself?
Yes, I do.
So you're already thinking.
And I don't ever change that.
Really?
Mm-mm.
So you, from the point of writing the libretto, you understand this is a baritone, this is a soprano.
Yeah.
Because the characters speak to you in that voice, what leads you to that decision?
You know, young people now have a phrase that I've come not to like a great deal, but I'll have to use it here in spite of that. It just feels right. In the case of Mice and Men, it never occurred to me to make Lenny anything but a tenor. Other people say, well, that's a bass. I said, a bass? I feel very strongly about vocal types. And I think that's impossible for him because he's a child.
Does the vocal type that you've determined in any way help shape the words that are attributed to that character's voice?
No.
Okay.
No. What does help shape it is just a special characteristic, like Lenny's being a child. I mean, that has its own effect on the way you set the words and the music.
Now, people in this room have been a little bit silent. Any questions for Carlisle from the room? All right, we have a taker here.
Is this on?
Yes.
This current opera, Prince of Players, is based on, or set in a historical context. So there's more source material than just the play that you're basing it on. There's a time period, there's historical convention. What sources do you take into account beyond the source material in helping to write your new libretto?
I'm not sure I got that.
So this opera that you've written is set in a particular time that is historically very rich.
Yeah.
Restoration, Charles I, Charles II. Do you do a good bit of historical reading and research in order to fill out the environment, the atmosphere of your opera?
I did with this one, yes. And it depends on what the opera, on what the material is. And this one, definitely. I would say that in All the King's Men of Robert Penn Warren, yes, I was very aware of what the book said, and that was probably the biggest challenge I've ever faced in terms of, because it's a novel that covers 30 years. And to put that in 3 acts on a stage and yet have a sense of real arc and a man's life was a huge undertaking. So that involved a great deal of thinking about that. In this present one, I read everything I could get my hands on, because it's a period that I don't know. I know generally what it was about. I know all about its route in this, its board in this, and what happened in England after the return of the king from France. But I wanted all the information I could get about things like I described earlier, the whole idea of what acting was in the theater. Because, you see, they had just come out of 20 years of no theater because of the Puritan Revolution. So I was curious as to how that affected how that affected the actors. And to add to that, the fact that there were no women on the stage. All of those things figured into it. So I think the answer is depending upon the material itself. And the opera that I finished before this was one in which I used the title of the book, again at the producer's insistence, Cold Sassy Tree is the name of the book and the opera. But I felt that it was material that I knew very intimately from my own childhood.
Yeah, exactly.
So that was, I felt maybe egotistically, but I didn't feel like I had a lot to learn from that.
Yeah. You used the word yesterday, atmosphere. Atmosphere in the opera. And I assume that you believe that there is a verbal dimension to creating atmosphere. We can imagine that music contributes to the atmosphere, but how does the libretto contribute to atmosphere?
Libretto contributes to music, which creates the atmosphere.
Okay.
Is that what you thought I was going to say?
I am ashamed that I didn't anticipate that answer. Because yeah.
Yeah, well, no, words have a certain kind of atmosphere that they can create, too, on the part of the speaker. But I think in this case, when you're dealing with two arts, one informs the other. Thank goodness. I mean, it's what makes operatic writing very exciting, I think, because you're always in touch with that first, what can you say? The first impetus has to be verbal. Then after that comes these other things that we've talked about.
A question from FSU.
Hi, my name is DK Isid. I was wondering, obviously, as you distill down a source story into a smaller libretto, you have to make certain modifications for dramatic effect, like you said before, combining characters, things like that. As that happens, I'm certain, unconsciously some of your own themes overtake the author's themes. Do you ever consciously try to modify those themes and imbue your own, or do you simply try to preserve as faithfully as you can the original intent?
The question is about adaptation once again, and as you're even thinking about the adaptation architecturally, do you try to follow the architecture of the source material, that this is where those peaks are, so I'll put them in the same place, this is the sort of scene order, so I'll kind of keep that, or do you even erase that and create your own architecture?
I've done it both ways. Generally speaking, if it's very precisely designated, I will follow the outline of the original source. But I'm thinking again about All the King's Men. It's such a vast book. It covers so much space and so many events. I couldn't do that. I mean, I have to find where my peaks are, where the act endings, where does the action lead to?
Because even in this one, the opera starts with a play, which is theatrical. Cold Sassy Tree wasn't a play; it's a novel.
Yeah.
So it doesn't have the same kind of theatrical rhythm.
That's right.
So you have to invent it there.
Yes, and we're still trying to decide how best to invent it. It's very difficult to set Shakespeare to music and yet give it the impression, make the impression absolutely final on the part of the audience that it's an actor doing it spoken. So we're still, I had said it actually for the male voice as falsetto. And yet I may come to that, because that's the way it's written now in the vocal score. But it may be a matter of setting those words which are so familiar to so many people. This is Desdemona's death scene, which we hear 3 times during the opera. And that's very familiar to most people, to an awful lot of people at least. and yet you want to project to the audience right from the beginning that they're watching a play, that this is not a play within a play.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it is, but it's a different, it's a more, what am I trying to say? It's a more elaborate medium to have it spoken.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I may have ended up having it spoken with the music I've written for the scene.
Because you're right, because it is literally a play within an opera.
That's right.
So they are theoretically spoken words by opera singers, so
That's
to sing
right.
them or not to sing them. Yeah.
So it's a question we'll probably work out in rehearsals.
So a solution waiting to happen. Okay. Are there other questions? Yeah, please.
Hello, Mr. Floyd. Thank you so much for this, the privilege of hearing the whole arc of your process of libretto creation. My question focuses on the very end. And I ask this interested as a conductor who often works with composers on their new works. How often, and if at all, why, when, would you ever have any tweaks to the libretto? I'm going to focus on librettos. I know we're not yet into anything else.
Right, right.
But tweaks to the libretto as late in the process as the preparation of its premiere. So when actual bodies and voices are inhabiting the roles, and or you're working with a conductor or a director you value, is there any tweaking of what gets said, sung, what gets added, or how it's changed anyway?
So how late in the process will you still make adjustments to the libretto?
Until opening night.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Yes, pretty much that.
What sort of things would lead that to happen?
In my experience, tucks, small areas that can tighten the scene. You seldom, well, at least I seldom have taken out big chunks. I can't say that I did that also during the rehearsal period. I've lost scenes in the rehearsal period, scenes that work quite well by themselves, but were not necessary to tell the story. I remember I had the great good fortune of working with Hal Prince, the famous Broadway director, on my opera, Willie Stark, based on All the King's Men. And in our run through, we did a very, very effective pre-opera in-house performance of it for me to see it. And there was one scene in it that I decided had to be taken out. It happened to be one of the most effective scenes in the piece, so I began sweating that one early. And in any case, I went to New York and I told him that we were taking out this scene, which we call the Miss Little Paw scene. And he said, why? Why? You know, he was first of all, very opposed to it. Then he said, no, don't tell me, don't tell me. He said, it's not her opera, is it? He got it immediately, you know. And I said, no, we can tell the whole story of the opera and omit the Miss Little Paw scene and have lost nothing except some of the most important material in that scene I can locate in other scenes. And that's what we did.
Fascinating. We have one final question, this one from CCM. Take it away, Cincinnati Conservatory of Music.
Hi, this is Talia again. I was wondering how you feel about your work being performed in translation. Thanks.
I didn't quite understand.
How do you feel about your work being performed in translation?
Thank you. Language of performance. When your works are performed in Europe, have they always been performed in English? Do they translate them? How do you feel about, do you have a preference in the original English or in the language of the country?
I prefer it in their language. I was trying to think of Susanna I saw in Berlin at the Deutsche Oper, and they did it in English with some of the strangest English you've ever heard on the stage.
But how would they translate ain't?
I don't remember that they did. but I mean, when you get into the Balkans, you get into different sounds of English. But the thing that pleased me was the fact they used super titles. Because super titles at that point were not really all that familiar. You never go now to an opera without expecting super titles. But I know one thing. I've only seen my works in Europe in English. I would be very uncomfortable if I thought there were no super titles. Which tells me something of the way we've operated all these many, many years.
So you've never heard your works performed in French or Italian?
No.
Okay.
No.
Interesting. Well, I am so sorry that we're coming to the end of our time together today, but I take heart that this is only the first of our 5 episodes, and that we have another one in November to talk about the piano vocal score, and we'll start talking musically then with Carlisle. But in the meantime, we are deeply grateful for your generosity, for your wisdom, for your insight about what makes a good libretto. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Carlisle Floyd.
Thank you, sir. Such a pleasure. Pleasure to meet you.